Chapter 14. Blaine. Anger still floated around Blaine as he pulled into the training facility Monday morning. After he'd sent Kenzi away, he'd not only had to finish taking out the furniture by himself, but he'd had to deal with the plumber and the flooring guy. Neither of them would be singing his praises to anyone soon. In addition, guilt over how he'd treated Kenzi had plagued him the rest of the weekend. He knew she didn't deserve the way he'd yelled at her, and now he had no idea how to make it right. Even though breakfast was the first thing on the agenda, Blaine walked to the locker room before heading to the cafeteria. He hoped a few moments of silence and solitude would calm him enough that he could face his teammates without displaying his anger. He'd certainly told them often enough not to bring emotions into the practices. Unfortunately, his hope for solitude was whisked away at the sight of Tucker in the room. Tucker glanced up and his stance stiffened when he saw Blaine. "You told Shelby we couldn't do the big brother thing? Why?" Blaine sighed as he set his bag down. He'd been hoping Shelby wouldn't mention the issue to Tucker, but he should have known better. "I have my reasons, but mainly because the season starts next week. We need our focus to be on the game. Teams are going to be gunning for us this year after our championship win last year, and we can't get distracted by outside influences." Tucker folded his arms across his chest and raised his eyebrows. "Outside influences like Kenzi?" Okay, Tucker had him there. He should have chosen his words better. "Kenzi is helping me redecorate a cabin I inherited so I can sell it." Was she still helping him? He was no longer sure. "That's not the entire truth, and you know it." Tucker shook his head. "You may have hired her, but you were also dating her. You can't lie to me, man, not when I'm engaged to her best friend." "We went on 3 dates, Blaine said as he shoved his bag into his locker. "I'd hardly call that dating." "Don't do that to her." "Do what?" Blaine asked, but he knew the answer. "Don't treat her like the other women that you go out with once or twice and then dump. I know something happened between the two of you the other day. Shelby told me Kenzi showed up at her place and was a mess. Now I know you're the captain, but something is going on with you, Blaine, and it's not good. You told me once that I needed to change my perspective. Well, I don't know what your deal is, but maybe it's time you change your perspective. Those kids need us. They look up to us. And all Shelby is asking is that we take some time and hang out with them. I don't think that's too much to ask, even during our season." "I can't be a big brother." The words exploded out of Blaine's mouth and reverberated in the locker room, but he was almost glad. The secret had been tearing him up for years, and saying the words out loud brought a small sense of relief. Tucker threw his hands out in exasperation. "Why not? It's just spending some time with someone younger. Take them out to movies, the park. What's so hard about that?" "Because I was a big brother once, and I let my little brother drown." Blaine collapsed onto the bench and hung his head. "I couldn't protect him, and I can't be responsible for another kid." Tucker sat down next to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Blaine, I'm sure whatever happened wasn't your fault." "No, it was my fault. We were supposed to be reading in the cabin, but I got bored. I suggested we go out on the lake, even though my parents said we weren't to go outside. He trusted me, so he went with me." Blaine rubbed a hand across the back of his neck as the memories rushed in. "At first it was great. The lake had frozen over and we were sliding all over the place. Then I heard the crack and Kevin scream. I saw him go down, but I couldn't swim, and neither could he." He closed his eyes and shuddered as the hardest memory of all surfaced in his mind's eye. "I could see him, under the ice, but I couldn't get to him. I watched him drown." There was a moment of silence before Tucker let out a long sigh. "Okay, that's definitely a heavy weight to bear. But you were just a kid, Blaine. You should never have been put in that situation. But I think you've carried this long enough." Blaine's head shot up. "How can you say that? He was my brother." "I know, but what happened was an accident. You remember how angry I was last year?" Blaine nodded, wondering what this had to do with his story. "Well, my mother died when I was young. Then my father grew distant and threw himself into his work. I thought he blamed me for my mother's death somehow, but really he was just grieving. I'm sorry for your loss, Tucker, but what does that have to do with me? Tucker's lips pulled into a small smile. I'm telling you because you saw what the misconception did to me. I turned to anger and drinking. You've distanced yourself from people, but you deserve love, Blaine. You deserve a relationship. And I don't know if Kenzi is that girl for you, but don't you think you owe it a chance? Blaine looked at his friend and wondered if he was right. Maybe it was time he changed his perspective. Kenzi. The knock on the door startled Kenzi out of her daydream, or nightmare, more like it. The bills were coming due, and now she had no money and no job on the horizon. She couldn't believe how things had turned bad so quickly. She closed her laptop as she pushed back from the table. A hand-me-down from her mother, it was still in pristine condition, as was everything her parents owned. Even though it belonged to Kenzi now, she still had trouble putting a glass down without a coaster or doing any design work on it in case her pen slipped and marred the tabletop. Her mother believed that people judged you by your house, and that had been drilled into Kenzi. She glanced at her watch as she crossed to the front door. It was nearly 8. Other than Shelby, she knew of no one who would show up at her door so late. Her parents certainly wouldn't, and she didn't have many other close friends. She hoped Tucker and Shelby hadn't had a fight. There was no doubt they would one day, but so far they'd been like two people sharing one mind. Her heart tightened as she peeked through the spy hole to see Blaine Hollis standing on her doorstep. His hands were shoved in his jean pockets, but his face was impossible to read. She bit her lip as she unlocked the door. If he was here to demand his money back, she didn't know what she would do. She'd use most of it to purchase the floors and hire the plumber. When the door opened and she saw his face up close, that thought flew from her head. His shoulders were rolled forward and a look of contrition covered his face. Hey, Kenzi, can I come in? She stepped back, allowing him entrance. She had no idea why he was here, but something was definitely weighing on him. Would you like to sit down? Her hand pointed to the couch, but it was more out of habit than an actual request. His eyes darted around the room before he shook his head. No, I'll be quick. I came to say I'm sorry. She waited to see if he would expound. What exactly was he sorry for? Hiring her? Asking her to dinner? Yelling at her? I don't know if you read the whole story on that newspaper clipping, but I lost my little brother when I was 10. He was my best friend. My parents trusted me to watch him inside, but I got bored and convinced him to go out on the lake with me. He lifted one hand from his pocket and ran it across the back of his neck. It had been cold that winter, and the lake had frozen. I didn't know the ice wasn't thick enough to hold us. When Kevin went under, I tried to save him, but neither of us could swim, and I couldn't get him back to the part where he'd fallen in. Kenzi gasped and covered her gaping mouth with her hand. The newspaper certainly hadn't shared that bit of information in its story. My life fell apart after that. My parents got divorced, my dad turned to drinking, and my mom worked 2 jobs just to keep us in a tiny apartment. I lost my brother and my family that winter, and I don't have relationships because I don't want to fail anyone else, nor am I sure I could handle the pain of losing anyone else. But I shouldn't have taken it out on you. He shook his head and took a few steps away from her. I felt different with you, but then you found the story, and I knew you would look at me differently. Everyone looks at me differently when they find out. He paused, as if waiting for her to say something. Then he shrugged. Anyway, I'm sorry. Kenzi felt the weight of his guilt, and she placed a hand on his arm. Blaine, you were just a kid. I'm sorry about your brother, but you've beat yourself up long enough. It's time to forgive yourself. How am I supposed to do that? With God's help. Blaine lifted his arm to run his hand across the back of his neck. I don't think God wants anything to do with me. That's where you're wrong, Blaine. God loves you. He sent his son to die for you, for all of us. It sounds awful, but the death of your brother was not a surprise to him, nor is what you're feeling now, but that doesn't mean he loves you any less. Blaine's hand shifted to his chin. Do you really believe that? Kenzi crossed to him and placed a hand on his arm. I do, and if you'll let me, I'd love to help you know him like I do. He held her gaze, and she could feel the emotions flowing between them. They crackled like electricity in the air. I'd like that. His voice was husky, and his eyes shifted from hers down to her lips and back again. He wanted to kiss her, and she wanted that too, more than anything. Her hand found his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat pounding beneath her palm. She lifted her face to his, and before she could move another inch, his mouth was on hers. Tentative at first, his lips barely brushed against hers, soft as a whisper. Was he afraid she would say no? She moved her hands to behind his neck and stood on her tiptoes in order to deepen the kiss. And boy, did it work. Her knees trembled and grew weak, and though she knew there was nothing there, she could have sworn she heard the sound of explosions. She had never experienced a kiss like that in her life, and he responded as if she were a lifeline in the ocean. His lips explored her as if they held the answer to relieve his pain. "Does this mean I'm not fired?" she asked when they finally pulled back. Blaine laughed and responded with another kiss. "You're definitely rehired, and I may just owe you a bonus for putting up with me." Kenzi knew there was a serious truth to his light-hearted words, but she had already fallen for Blaine. She just hoped he wouldn't break her heart.